The gavel fell with a heavy definitive crack that echoed through the cavernous courtroom like an executioner's axe. To the wealthy lawyers in their tailored suits, it was just another ordinary day. To her son Darius, it was the sound of his mother's life being shattered. A chorus of sneers and stifled laughter rippled through the gallery as the judge peered over his glasses, openly mocking the young man clutching a battered leather briefcase. They saw a kid out of his depth. They saw an easy victory. What they did not know was that moments later, this supposed ignorant kid was going to completely dismantle their corrupt empire, rewrite legal precedent, and deliver a blow of devastating karma that nobody saw coming. The rusted hinges of the mailbox at 442 West Oak Street squeaked a familiar, depressing tune as Elena Brooks pulled out yet another thick manila envelope. Her hands, calloused and scarred from years of cleaning industrial kitchens, trembled slightly as she read the return address. Langford and Beckett Real Estate Holdings. Elena was a woman carved from resilience. She had raised her son Darius single-handedly in a neighborhood where hope was a luxury few could afford. Every extra dollar she made scrubbing grease off commercial fryers went into paying the mortgage on their small two-bedroom home. A home that was supposed to be their sanctuary, their slice of the American dream. But for months that dream had morphed into a suffocating nightmare. Damon Langford, a notoriously ruthless property developer, had zeroed in on their block. He was a man who viewed people not as human beings, but as obstacles in the way of his multi-million-dollar luxury condo projects. When Elena refused his aggressive lowball cash offer for her property, Damon Langford did not walk away. He unleashed his lawyers using a convoluted, deeply buried technicality regarding an obscure municipal zoning tax that Elena's deceased husband had allegedly misfiled years earlier. Damon Langford's legal team placed an exorbitant retroactive lien on her home. The interest compounded daily, illegally, but hidden behind impenetrable legal jargon. It was a classic corporate strangulation tactic. Bleed the poor dry in court until they surrendered their deeds out of sheer desperation. Darius watched his mother collapse onto the worn living room sofa, the eviction notice slipping from her fingers. "Mom," Darius said softly, picking up the heavy cream-colored paper. The header read, "Notice of summary judgment and foreclosure. They want us out by the end of the month." "I called legal aid, baby," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "They said it is too complex. The wait list is months. Damon Langford's lawyers filed an expedited motion. We do not have the money for a real attorney." He won, Darius. He took everything. A cold, hardened resolve settled into Darius's chest. He looked at the paperwork. The late attorney for Damon Langford was Preston Hale, a man known in legal circles as the Bulldog of Broad Street. Preston Hale charged $800 an hour and had a reputation for humiliating opposition. "No, Mom," Darius said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight far beyond his years. He did not win. He made a mistake. He left a paper trail. For the following weeks, Darius did not sleep. While his peers were going to parties and worrying about final exams, Darius transformed a small bedroom into a war room. He printed out hundreds of pages of property records from the county clerk's online database. He cross-referenced Damon Langford's previous acquisitions, tracing a years-long pattern of predatory liens. He discovered that Damon Langford and Preston Hale operated through a network of shell companies specifically targeting elderly or minority homeowners who lacked the resources to fight back. But Recognizing a scam and proving it in a court of law were two vastly different things. Darius knew he needed a silver bullet. He spent nights poring over the state civil practice and remedies code. He dug into archival case law from decades ago, searching for anything that could pierce the corporate veil Damon Langford hid behind. Then late one night on a rainy Thursday, he found it. A forgotten, unrepealed statute from decades ago regarding fraudulent conveyance and malicious clouding of title. It was a legal relic, dusty and ignored, but theoretically active. Combined with a recent Supreme Court ruling on procedural due process, it was a lethal combination. When the morning of the hearing arrived, Elena was physically sick with anxiety. She had resigned herself to homelessness, but Darius, dressed in an oversized thrift store suit that hung loosely off his lanky frame, looked oddly calm. He carried a heavy scuffed leather briefcase he had bought at a garage sale for $4. "Darius, please do not make it worse," Elena pleaded as they walked up the intimidating marble steps of the county courthouse. Judges do not like when regular people try to play lawyer. "I am not playing, Mom," Darius replied, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B. And today, neither are they. Courtroom 3B was an imposing theater of mahogany and polished brass designed to make the ordinary citizen feel small and insignificant. Judge Theodore Harlan, a stern man with a reputation for a short temper and a low tolerance for unrepresented defendants, presided over the morning docket. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was Preston Hale. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, idly scrolling through his expensive smartphone, radiating the arrogant boredom of a predator waiting for a caged rabbit. Next to him sat Damon Langford himself, present only because he enjoyed watching his victim squirm during the final judgment. Damon Langford checked his gold Rolex, irritated that he had to be in a room with people he considered beneath him. When the clerk called the case, Langford Holdings LLC versus Elena Brooks, Elena's legs nearly gave out. Darius placed a steadying hand on her arm and walked with her to the defendant's table. Preston Hale stood up, buttoning his jacket with a slick smile. "Your Honor, Preston Hale, representing the plaintiff. This is a straightforward matter. The defendant has defaulted on a legally binding property lien, failing to satisfy the debt for months. We are asking for immediate summary judgment and transfer of deed." Judge Theodore Harlan flipped through the file, barely glancing at Elena. "Mrs. Brooks, you are appearing pro se, without counsel. The court strongly advised you to seek an attorney at the preliminary hearing." Elena opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was dry. Before she could force a word out, Darius stood up. "Your Honor," Darius's voice rang out, surprisingly steady and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the courtroom. "My name is Darius Brooks. I am the defendant's son. Under Section 14, Subsection B of the State Civil Procedure Code regarding designated advocacy, Shibi. In cases of financial hardship, I have filed the proper documentation with the clerk to serve as my mother's legal representative for this hearing." A beat of absolute silence hit the room. Then Preston Hale let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter. Damon Langford chuckled, shaking his head. A few junior associates sitting in the gallery openly giggled. Judge Theodore Harlan slammed his gavel, his face flushing with annoyance. "Order. Young man, this is not a high school mock trial. This is a court of law. The statute you are referring to is an archaic provision meant for designated social workers, not teenagers who have watched too many legal dramas on television. With all due respect, Your Honor, Darius countered, refusing to break eye contact with the judge. The statute's language explicitly states any designated kin or agent in the event the defendant falls below the poverty line and is denied public defense in civil forfeiture. The clerk stamped and accepted the motion this morning. It is legally binding. I am her representative. Preston Hale sauntered to the center of the floor, feigning amusement. Your Honor, I object to this circus. Plaintiff has multi-million-dollar development stalled because this child wants to play attorney. I ask that you strike his motion and issue the summary judgment immediately. The lien is valid. The debt is unpaid. There is nothing to argue. Judge Theodore Harlan sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at Darius with pity disguised as contempt. Mr. Brooks, I will give you a few minutes to present a valid defense. If you cannot provide legal justification for why this lien should not be executed, I will rule in favor of the plaintiff, and your mother will lose this property today. Do you understand? Loud and clear, Your Honor, Darius said. He unlatched the cheap brass clasps of his briefcase. They popped open with a loud click that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of papers, heavily highlighted and tabbed. Damon Langford leaned back in his chair, whispering something to Preston Hale. Both men smiled smugly. They were ready for a sob story. They were ready for the kid to beg for more time, to cry about fairness. Corporations like Damon Langford's thrived on tears. They were immune to them. Darius did not cry. He did not ask for pity. He walked out from behind the table holding a single piece of paper, his posture radiating a terrifyingly cold confidence. Your Honor, Darius began, his tone shifting from respectful young man to surgical inquisitor. Mr. Hale claims this is a straightforward matter of an unpaid tax lien. However, the plaintiff has strategically omitted the origin of this lien. They claim it stems from a municipal zoning tax error by my late father. Because it does, Preston Hale interrupted lazily. The paperwork is in the file. Is it? Darius asked, turning his gaze to Preston Hale. Or is it a fabrication created by a shell company to extort land? Judge Theodore Harlan's eyes narrowed. Watch your accusations, young man. You are treading on defamation. I am stating a fact, Your Honor, backed by the plaintiff's own filings, Darius said smoothly. If the court directs its attention to Exhibit A in my packet, it is the original deed of the property signed years ago. Now, please look at Exhibit B, the supposed notice of default that Mr. Hale's firm filed against my mother months ago to establish the lien. Judge Theodore Harlan flipped through the pages Darius referenced, frowning. Darius took a step closer to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Hale, could you please tell the court what date is printed on the original zoning tax form that you claim my father signed, which initiated this entire debt? Preston Hale rolled his eyes, annoyed by the charade. It is clearly stamped from decades ago. Yes, it is. Darius nodded slowly. The courtroom was dead silent now. And could you please tell the court what year the specific municipal zoning code section you cite as the reason for the tax penalty was enacted by the city council? Preston Hale hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the veteran lawyer's face. He glanced at his notes. It is a standard zoning code. The exact year is irrelevant to the default. It is entirely relevant, Your Honor. Darius's voice boomed, Suddenly commanding the room, he pointed directly at Damon Langford. Because that section of the Municipal Zoning Code was not drafted, voted on, or enacted until years after my father supposedly violated it and signed a penalty acknowledgement, a low murmur broke out in the gallery. Judge Theodore Harlan looked up sharply, staring at the paperwork. My father could not have signed a penalty acknowledgement for a law that did not exist yet, Darius stated, his words hitting like physical blows. The document Mr. Hale filed to initiate this lien is chronologically impossible. It is a backdated, manufactured forgery. The color drained from Preston Hale's face. He snatched his copy of the files, his eyes darting across the dates. Your Honor, this is a clerical error, a minor discrepancy in the filing dates by the city clerk's office. A minor discrepancy, Darius interrupted, pacing the floor like a seasoned prosecutor. Your Honor, a clerical error is misspelling a name. Manufacturing a tax penalty for a law that had not yet been legislated and using it to place a $40,000 lien on a widow's home is not an error. Under Title 18, Section 1341 of the United States Code, using the mail and court systems to execute this forgery constitutes federal fraud. Damon Langford abruptly stood up, his face red with sudden rage. This is outrageous. I am not going to sit here and be accused of fraud by a thug in a cheap suit. Mr. Langford, you will sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt, Judge Theodore Harlan roared. His previous dismissal of Darius entirely vanished. The judge looked at Darius, his expression a mix of shock and intense curiosity. Mr. Brooks, this is a severe allegation. Even if the date is inconsistent, proving willful forgery by the plaintiff requires substantial evidence. I have it, Your Honor, Darius said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. He turned back to his briefcase and pulled out a bound ledger, dropping it onto the defendant's table with a heavy thud. When I noticed the chronological impossibility of my mother's lien, Darius explained, I did not stop there. I legally requested the public records of all property acquisitions made by Damon Langford Holdings, LLC, over the years within low-income zip codes. I found dozens of properties. Darius walked over to Preston Hale and handed him a copy, then approached the bench to hand one to the judge. Out of those properties, Your Honor, the vast majority of them were seized through summary judgments based on unpaid municipal tax liens, Darius continued. And in all those cases, the liens were initiated by claiming the homeowners violated a specific section of the zoning code. Furthermore, in many of those cases, the alleged violations occurred before the code was even enacted. The silence in the courtroom was now deafening. The junior lawyers in the back row stopped whispering. They were witnessing a legal massacre. A high school kid was not just defending his mother. He was unwinding a multi-million-dollar corporate racketeering scheme in real time. Objection! Preston Hale shouted, his voice cracking slightly. He was sweating now, his tailored suit suddenly looking very uncomfortable. This is beyond the scope of this hearing. We are here for Elena Brooks's property, not an audit of my client's business history. It goes directly to the pattern of malicious intent, Your Honor, Darius fired back instantly. Which brings me to my legal defense. I am invoking the precedent of Harrison versus the state of Georgia from decades ago. Judge Theodore Harlan leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows raised so high they nearly touched his hairline. Harrison? That case has not been cited in the state in decades. Perhaps it should be, Your Honor, Darius said. In Harrison, the appellate court ruled that if a plaintiff uses an intentionally fabricated debt to place a malicious clouding of title on a property, the court is not only required to dismiss the lien, but under the doctrine of unclean hands, the plaintiff forfeits all legal claims to any debt owed and is subject to immediate punitive damages, payable to the defendant to clear the title. That law was effectively neutralized by the Tort Reform Act, Preston Hale argued frantically, wiping his forehead. The kid does not know what he is talking about. Darius smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster saying checkmate. Mr. Hale is partially correct, Darius addressed the judge. The Tort Reform Act did place caps on punitive damages in standard torts. However, a specific section of the Reform Act specifically exempts cases involving, and I quote, fraud upon the court perpetrated by an officer of the court. Mr. Hale signed these affidavits himself. He is an officer of the court. Therefore, the Harrison precedent stands fully intact. Darius turned to look directly at Damon Langford, whose arrogant sneer had entirely collapsed into a mask of pure panic. By their own filings, Damon Langford Holdings and Mr. Hale have admitted to defrauding this court to steal my mother's home, Darius concluded, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Therefore, Your Honor, I am not just asking you to deny their motion for summary judgment. I am filing a counter motion right now under Harrison. Darius slid a final piece of paper across the judge's bench. I am asking the court to dissolve the lien, declare the property free and clear, and order Damon Langford Holdings to pay punitive damages for malicious clouding of title to the sum of $2 million. The silence in courtroom 3B was absolute. The kind of heavy, breathless quiet that precedes a devastating storm. Darius Brooks, a high school student in a thrift store suit, stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the judge. The $800 an hour lawyer across the aisle looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. Judge Theodore Harlan slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked at the ledger Darius had provided, then at the supposedly legally binding notice of default filed by Preston Hale, and finally down at the Harrison precedent from decades ago. The judge was a man who had spent decades on the bench. He had seen every trick, every loophole, and every dirty tactic corporate law had to offer. But he had never seen a multi-million-dollar real estate empire completely dismantled by a teenager so swiftly. Mr. Hale, Judge Theodore Harlan began, his voice dangerously low, stripped of any courtroom pleasantries. I am looking at a municipal zoning statute enacted years after the alleged violation, and I am looking at an affidavit signed by you under penalty of perjury, claiming Mr. Brooks's father violated this statute before it existed, creating a debt that you subsequently used to try and seize this woman's home. Would you care to explain this chronological impossibility before I call the state bar? Preston Hale stammered. The smooth, arrogant bulldog of Broad Street was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified man staring down the barrel of disbarment and a federal indictment. Your Honor, my paralegals prepare these filings, Preston Hale deflected, his voice shaking. Our firm handles thousands of liens a year. We rely on the raw data provided by our client, Damon Langford Holdings. If the dates are inaccurate, It is a gross oversight by the client's internal auditing department, not a willful deception by this firm. Damon Langford shot out of his chair as if he had been physically struck. "You lying parasite!" Damon Langford bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at his own lawyer. "You told me this was airtight. You said the retroactive municipal clauses would bypass the statute of limitations. You drafted the damn paperwork." "Order! Both of you shut your mouths!" Judge Theodore Harlan roared, slamming his gavel so hard the brass plaque on his desk rattled. The bailiff, a burly man named Officer Davis, immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on his duty belt, ready to intervene. Darius did not flinch. He watched the two powerful men turn on each other like cornered rats. This was the twist he had anticipated. He knew that in the face of federal prison, there is no loyalty among thieves. "Your Honor," Preston Hale said, desperately trying to regain his composure, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. Given the complications brought forth by the defendant, the plaintiff would like to formally withdraw the motion for summary judgment. We ask to dismiss this case without prejudice so we may review our internal records. Preston Hale was trying to pull the ripcord. A dismissal without prejudice meant they could drop the lawsuit, walk away, and sweep the forgery under the rug, potentially refiling later when Darius was not looking. Elena Brooks let out a sharp breath of relief, her hands covering her face. Just dropping the case was a miracle to her. It meant they got to keep their home. She looked at her son, pleading with her eyes to accept the victory and leave. But Darius was not there just to save his mother. He was there to ensure Damon Langford could never do this to another family again. "Objection, Your Honor," Darius stated firmly, stepping in front of the plaintiff's table, cutting off Preston Hale's escape route. The plaintiff cannot withdraw a fraudulent claim simply because they were caught committing the fraud in open court. The countermotion, under Harrison, has already been filed. The moment Mr. Hale submitted forged documents to this court to initiate a property seizure, the crime of malicious clouding of title was complete. Dismissing the case now does not erase the perjury, nor does it compensate my mother for the severe emotional and financial distress inflicted upon her. Judge Theodore Harlan leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled hands. He stared at Darius with a mixture of profound respect and disbelief. "Mr. Brooks is entirely correct, Counselor," Theodore Harlan said sharply to Preston Hale. "You do not get to attempt a judicial robbery and then simply say, 'Never mind when the alarm goes off.'" "Your Honor, this is absurd," Damon Langford yelled, completely losing his temper, ignoring the bailiff's warning step toward him. "You are not seriously going to entertain a $2 million counter from a kid who read a law book yesterday. I know Mayor Thomas. I know the appellate judges. This is a kangaroo court." The courtroom gasped. Junior lawyers in the gallery physically cringed. Threatening a sitting judge and name-dropping politicians was legal suicide. Judge Theodore Harlan's eyes grew cold and dead. "Mr. Langford, one more word out of turn, and you will spend the next day or two in a holding cell for contempt. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Damon Langford clamped his jaw shut, his chest heaving, a vein throbbing violently in his forehead. "Bailiff," Judge Theodore Harlan commanded, not breaking eye contact with Damon Langford, "confiscate the plaintiff's case files immediately. All of them. Place them into evidence. Nobody from the plaintiff's table leaves this room until those documents are secured." Officer Davis immediately moved to Preston Hale's table, scooping up the thick, expensive leather binders. Preston Hale did not try to stop him. He just stared blankly at the mahogany table, realizing his entire career had just evaporated. The air in the room was electric. Word had already begun to leak out into the hallways of the courthouse. A few curious attorneys had slipped through the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery, drawn by the rumors of a high school kid politically executing Preston Hale. Darius returned to his seat next to his mother. Elena was weeping silently, not out of fear anymore, but out of an overwhelming, crushing shock. Her teenage son had just fought off two of the most dangerous men in the city and brought them to their knees. She squeezed his hand, her grip fiercely tight. "You did it, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is not over yet, Mom," Darius replied softly, his eyes still fixed on the judge. "We need a ruling on the record." Judge Theodore Harlan spent the next several minutes meticulously reviewing Darius's countermotion, checking the citations, and verifying the application of the Harrison precedent against the exemptions of the Tort Reform Act. Finally, he looked up, the courtroom hanging on his every breath. "In my decades on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a flagrant, malicious abuse of the judicial system as I have seen today from the plaintiff," Judge Theodore Harlan announced, his voice projecting loud and clear for the court reporter to capture every syllable. Damon Langford Holdings, LLC, acting through its legal counsel, attempted to use the authority of this court to extort property through demonstrably forged documents. Damon Langford closed his eyes, his face pale. "Therefore," Judge Theodore Harlan continued, "I am denying the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment. Furthermore, I am granting the defendant's countermotion in its entirety under the precedent of Harrison versus the state of Georgia. The lien against the property at 442 West Oak Street is hereby dissolved with prejudice. The title is declared free and clear." A collective gasp of shock and quiet cheers from a few locals who had snuck into the back rows echoed through the room. "But we are not finished," the judge's voice boomed over the noise. "Given the irrefutable evidence of a manufactured municipal tax penalty, I find the plaintiff liable for malicious clouding of title. I am ordering Damon Langford Holdings, LLC, to pay punitive damages to Mrs. Elena Brooks in the amount of $2 million. This amount is to be placed into a court-monitored escrow account pending any appeals." Preston Hale dropped his head into his hands. It was a catastrophic financial blow, but more importantly, it set a lethal legal precedent. If one of Damon Langford's victims won a $2 million settlement for this specific type of fraud, the other families Darius had identified would immediately file identical lawsuits. It would bankrupt the entire corporate entity. But Darius was not done pulling the strings. The young genius had planned for the aftermath. Just as Judge Theodore Harlan struck his gavel to adjourn the hearing, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. In walked Julian Price, a veteran investigative journalist for the State Chronicle, accompanied by a cameraman. Days prior, Darius had mailed Julian Price a duplicate package of the fraudulent property seizures, complete with a timeline and a tip about the hearing. Julian Price had spent the time verifying the documents with the city clerk's office. He knew it was the biggest corporate corruption scandal the city had seen in years. "Mr. Langford!" Julian Price shouted over the commotion of the adjourning court, pointing a digital recorder like a weapon as Damon Langford tried to sprint for the side exit. Julian Price, State Chronicle. Care to comment on the allegations that your firm has systematically defrauded dozens of low-income families using backdated municipal codes? The State Attorney General's office just confirmed they are opening a racketeering inquiry based on these documents. Damon Langford froze, physically cornered between the bailiff, the journalist, and the heavy wooden railing of the gallery. The flashes of the camera illuminated his panicked, sweaty face. Karma had not just arrived, it had kicked the door down. Darius stood up, carefully placing his papers back into his scuffed $4 briefcase. He snapped the brass clasps shut. He did not gloat. He did not cheer. He simply offered his arm to his mother. Elena stood, her posture straighter than it had been in years. The heavy, invisible weight that had been crushing her chest for months was entirely gone. They walked down the center aisle of the courtroom together. As they passed the plaintiff's table, Preston Hale looked up, his eyes hollow. "Who are you?" the defeated lawyer asked, his voice barely a whisper. Darius paused, looking down at the man who had tried to steal his mother's life. "I am Elena Brooks' son," Darius said evenly, "and I think you are in my seat." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B did not just open, they practically exploded outward as Damon Langford shoved his way into the marble hallway, but the sanctuary he expected to find was gone. Instead, he was blinded by a chaotic, strobing wall of camera flashes. Julian Price's cameraman had tipped off the local news affiliates, and the corridor was now swarming with hungry reporters who had caught wind of the billionaire's humiliating defeat at the hands of a teenager. Damon Langford, a man who typically orchestrated his public appearances down to the color of his tie, looked like a hunted animal. His face was a mottled, furious red, sweat beading on his forehead and soaking into the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He raised his heavy leather briefcase, using it as a pathetic shield against the blinding lights and the barrage of microphones thrust into his face. "Mr. Langford, is it true your firm forged documents to evict low-income families?" a reporter from Channel 8 shouted, nearly tripping backward to keep the camera on him. "Get out of my way! No comment!" Damon Langford roared, his voice cracking with panic. He violently shoved a boom microphone aside, his legendary composure entirely shattered. He practically sprinted toward the private service elevators, leaving his legal counsel behind to face the wolves. Preston Hale did not even attempt to run. The bulldog of Broad Street walked out of the courtroom with the slow, unsteady gait of a dead man walking. He did not shield his face from the cameras. He did not issue a fiery no comment. He simply slumped onto a hardwood bench against the courthouse wall, dropping his head into his trembling hands. He stared at the scuffed marble floor, his mind racing through the catastrophic math of his situation. He had committed federal perjury. He had manufactured fraudulent court documents. He was looking at years in a federal penitentiary, and his law license was as good as incinerated. That evening, the State Chronicle hit the web, and the internet practically broke in half. Julian Price's exposé was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, fueled entirely by the meticulously sourced ledger Darius had handed him. The headline screamed across every screen in the city, "The $40 million forgery." How a teenager exposed a real estate tycoon. The article did not just recount the courtroom drama. It laid bare the entirely cold, calculated mechanics of Damon Langford's empire. Julian Price published the side-by-side comparisons of the forged tax documents against the zoning laws. But the most devastating part of the article was the list. Julian Price had published the addresses of the other properties in low-income zip codes that Damon Langford Holdings had seized, using the exact same backdated municipal code. The public reaction was not just outrage, it was a digital earthquake. Social media platforms erupted. Legal analysts on national cable news networks spent their entire evening segments dissecting the sheer brilliance of Darius's application of the Harrison precedent from decades ago. The David versus Goliath narrative was irresistible. But this was not just a feel-good story. It was a blueprint for a massive criminal conspiracy. Within hours of the article going live, the switchboards of the mayor's office and the state attorney general's office crashed from the sheer volume of citizens demanding immediate arrests. While the city demanded justice, Damon Langford was doing what cornered billionaires do best, trying to buy and burn his way out of the consequences. That night, the atmosphere inside the glass-walled penthouse of the Damon Langford Holdings corporate headquarters was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and burnt paper. The heavy industrial shredders were running so hot that they were physically smoking. Damon Langford had bypassed his usual security protocols and summoned only his most complicit inner circle, his chief financial officer, Thomas Reed, and his head of IT security. Boxes of physical files, the ones that had not been seized by Judge Theodore Harlan's bailiff, were being rapidly fed into the grinding teeth of the machines by panicked junior executives. Faster, Thomas Reed. I want every single file with Royce Caldwell's name on it turned into confetti, Damon Langford bellowed, pacing the floor with a glass of scotch shaking in his hand. Royce Caldwell was the corrupt city clerk who had been backdating the municipal zoning stamps for a cash bribe per property. If they cannot prove the chain of custody on the remaining properties, it is just a civil dispute. We can drown them in appellate courts for years. The shredders are jamming, Victor, Thomas Reed yelled back, his tie discarded, desperately trying to force a thick stack of manila folders into the overheated machine. Across the room, the IT director was frantically typing on a terminal, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the monitor. I am running the wiping software on the servers now, Mr. Langford, but there is a problem. There is a massive data packet that was already extracted this morning. Somebody copied the entire Caldwell email directory before we even went to court today. Damon Langford hurled his scotch glass against the floor-to-ceiling window. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the amber liquid staining the expensive Persian rug. Then smashed the physical drives. Do I have to do everything myself? Damon Langford screamed. He grabbed a heavy steel-shafted golf club from a bag in the corner of his office and began violently smashing the external hard drives stacked on the IT desk, plastic and silicone exploding across the room. Breathing heavily, Damon Langford pulled out his cell phone. He dialed the personal number of Mayor Thomas, a man whose election campaigns Damon Langford had heavily funded for years. The phone rang before going directly to an automated voicemail. He dialed the chief of police. Voicemail. The rats were abandoning the sinking ship. His money, his influence, his power. It was all evaporating, completely undone by a teenager from West Oak Street. Suddenly, the soft melodic chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the penthouse. Every single person in the room froze. The IT director stopped typing. Thomas Reed paused with a handful of half-shredded documents. The only people with the encrypted keycard to access the top floor were already in the room. The polished steel doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Half a dozen men and women, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI, printed in bold yellow across the back, stepped into the lavish lobby. They were heavily armed, moving with precise practice efficiency. Behind them, stepping confidently onto the plush carpet, was State Attorney General Victoria Lang. She was a formidable, no-nonsense prosecutor who had built her career taking down organized crime syndicates. "Step away from the shredders and put down the golf club, Mr. Langford," Victoria Lang commanded, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. She held up a thick-bound stack of papers signed by a federal judge. "You are making an absolute mess of federal evidence." Damon Langford's jaw dropped, his false bravado entirely collapsing. "This is private property, Victoria Lang. You have no jurisdiction here based on a civil court rumor. I want my lawyers." "It is not a rumor, Damon." A tired, utterly defeated voice echoed from the back of the elevator. The FBI agents parted slightly, and Preston Hale stepped out into the light of the penthouse. He was no longer wearing his expensive bespoke Italian suit. He was wearing a standard-issue, gray college sweatshirt and faded jeans. He looked like he had not slept in days, his eyes hollow and ringed with dark shadows. "Preston Hale," Damon Langford hissed, his eyes darting toward the emergency stairwell, calculating a run for it before realizing agents were already blocking the doors. "What did you do, you spineless parasite?" "What I had to do to avoid dying in a federal cage," Preston Hale mumbled, unable to meet his former boss's furious gaze. "The kid did not just give the ledger to the press, Damon. He filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Attorney General's Cybercrime Division this morning. He included the IP addresses of the shell companies we used to route the fake tax payments to Royce Caldwell." Damon Langford stared at his lawyer in absolute horror. You wore a wire?" "I did not need to," Preston Hale said, gesturing to the IT servers Damon Langford had just tried to smash. "The FBI was already mirroring our servers when you started trying to delete the Caldwell emails an hour ago. They watched you order the destruction of evidence in real time. It is over, Damon. I signed a proper agreement an hour ago. I gave them everything." The absolute betrayal hit Damon Langford so hard, his knees visibly buckled. The irony was suffocating, almost poetic in its cruelty. For years, Damon Langford had built his massive fortune on the fundamental premise that the legal system was a weapon only the wealthy could afford to swing. He had weaponized obscure laws to steal homes from vulnerable people, assuming they were too uneducated, too poor, and too tired to fight back. Now, an underprivileged high school kid had weaponized that exact same system to dismantle him. And his own highly paid legal attack dog had sold him out to save his own skin. Karma had not just knocked on the door of the penthouse. It had executed a federal raid. "Damon Langford, Attorney General," Victoria Lang said coldly, nodding to the two lead FBI agents. "You are under arrest for dozens of counts of federal fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit extortion, and the destruction of evidence." The agents moved in swiftly, grabbing Damon Langford by the arms. The harsh metallic click-click of cold steel handcuffs snapping onto the wrists of the billionaire echoed loudly in the quiet penthouse as they led a pale, speechless Damon Langford toward the elevator. The heavy industrial shredder behind his desk finally gave out, emitting a loud whine before grinding to a complete and permanent halt. It was the perfect final sound to mark the death of a corrupt empire. The morning after the FBI raided the Damon Langford Holdings penthouse, the atmosphere at 442 West Oak Street was entirely unrecognizable. The oppressive, suffocating cloud of terror that had choked the small house for months had completely evaporated, replaced by the warm golden light of the early morning sun streaming through the kitchen window. Eleanor Brooks stood by the stove, humming a soft, soulful melody as she flipped pancakes on the cast-iron skillet. For the first time in almost a year, her shoulders were not tight with anxiety. She felt incredibly light. She felt free. She looked out the window at the small, slightly overgrown front yard, the cracked concrete driveway, and the old oak tree near the sidewalk. It was not a mansion, but it was officially, unequivocally, and forever hers. The heavy, familiar thud of the morning paper hitting the wooden porch broke her peaceful reverie. Darius, already dressed and ready for school, opened the front door. The rusted hinges of the mailbox did not sound like a death knell anymore. They just sounded like old metal. He picked up the thick Sunday edition of the State Chronicle and smiled, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Above the fold, taking up nearly half the page, was a massive high-definition photograph of Damon Langford. The billionaire was not wearing his customary tailored Italian suit. He was wearing a rumpled, sweat-stained dress shirt, his wrists bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs, being practically dragged into the back of an armored federal transport van by two stone-faced FBI agents. The headline above the photo roared in bold black ink. Tycoon toppled. Damon Langford charged with dozens of counts of federal fraud and racketeering. But it was the sub-headline that made Darius walk into the kitchen and slide the newspaper across the worn Formica table to his mother. Judge freezes Damon Langford assets. $2 million punitive settlement clears escrow for local hero. True to his word, and acting under the intense white-hot scrutiny of the public eye and the glaring camera lenses of the local news networks, Judge Theodore Harlan had moved with unprecedented speed. Recognizing that a federal indictment would likely trigger a massive asset freeze, Theodore Harlan had signed a judicial order expediting the punitive damages directly from Damon Langford's corporate holding accounts. The transfer had cleared the wire that morning. $2 million was now resting safely in an ironclad court-monitored escrow account solely in Elena Brooks's name. Elena wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and looked down at the headline. Tears immediately welled in her eyes, spilling over her eyelashes and tracing lines down her cheeks. But this time, they were not tears of desperation or exhaustion. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy and relief. Oh my God! She walked around the small kitchen table and wrapped her arms around her son, burying her face in his shoulder, holding on to him as if he had just pulled her from a burning building. "You saved us, Darius," she whispered, her voice choked with heavy emotion. "You saved all of us. I thought we had lost everything." "We saved ourselves, Mom," Darius replied softly, hugging her back just as tightly. "They just made the fatal mistake of thinking we did not know how to read." The fallout from that single explosive morning in courtroom 3B became historic. It did not just end with the arrest of Damon Langford, Preston Hale, and the corrupt city clerk, Royce Caldwell. Weeks later, the state Supreme Court convened a special session to officially codify Judge Theodore Harlan's ruling. It entered the state's legal textbooks permanently and irreversibly as the Brooks precedent. The new legal doctrine was a massive, impenetrable shield for the working class. it strictly stipulated that any corporate entity found guilty of using backdated, forged, or manipulated municipal documents to maliciously cloud a residential title would not only immediately forfeit the property, but would be subjected to mandatory, uncapped punitive damages. It completely stripped predatory real estate developers of their favorite, most lethal weapon. Because of the meticulous, heavily cross-referenced ledger Darius had compiled in his bedroom, State Attorney General Victoria Lang did not have to spend months building a case. She used Darius's exact paperwork to track down the other families who had been illegally evicted by Damon Langford Holdings over the years. Utilizing the newly minted Brooks precedent, state prosecutors swiftly moved through the appellate courts, systematically reversing every single one of the fraudulent summary judgments. Months later, families who had been living in cramped apartments or homeless shelters were handed back the deeds to their stolen homes. Old Mrs. Gable got her bungalow back. The Henderson family returned to their duplex, and along with their properties, each family received a substantial restitution check carved directly out of the seized and liquidated Damon Langford corporate estate. Darius Brooks did not just save his mother from living on the streets. He resurrected an entire community that a billionaire had tried to pave over. As for Darius, his life completely changed trajectory overnight. He no longer had to sneak past the security guards at the local university law library to read tort law. The dean of admissions at the state university personally drove to Darius's underfunded public high school, walking into the principal's office to offer Darius a full ride, all expenses paid undergraduate scholarship, complete with a signed, guaranteed letter of admission to their prestigious law school upon his graduation. But they were not the only ones. For weeks, the squeaky mailbox at 442 West Oak Street was stuffed with thick embossed envelopes. Letters from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Columbia flooded in, practically begging the young legal prodigy to consider gracing their campuses. Despite the sudden wealth from the $2 million settlement, Elena absolutely refused to move out of her neighborhood. Instead, they used a portion of the money to renovate the house they loved. They fixed the sagging roof, put in new hardwood floors, and expanded the kitchen so Elena had enough room to cook properly. Elena immediately quit her grueling, bone-aching job scrubbing industrial fryers. She used her newfound time and resources to establish the Oak Street Housing Coalition, a nonprofit community outreach program dedicated to providing free legal aid and financial literacy to low-income families navigating predatory lending, redlining, and housing disputes. Years later, the heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung open once again. The grand auditorium was packed to absolute capacity, standing room only. Sitting right in the front row, wearing a beautiful floral dress and beaming with an indescribable radiant pride, was Elena Brooks. Next to her sat Julian Price, the journalist who had helped break the story, his digital camera resting on his lap. Standing at the front of the room, raising his right hand, was Darius. He did not look like the scared, lanky teenager in the oversized $4 thrift store suit anymore. He wore a sharp, perfectly tailored navy suit. He looked exactly like what he had become, a brilliant, unyielding force of nature. Administering the oath of the State Bar Association was a slightly older, grayer Judge Theodore Harlan. The judge smiled warmly as he recited the words, entirely honored to swear in the young man who had once schooled his entire courtroom. Darius had walked into a rigged game designed to crush him, learned the rules better than the men who wrote them, and shattered the entire board to pieces. Karma is often described as a mystical, invisible force of the universe, a slow-moving pendulum of justice. But sometimes karma does not wait for the universe to act. Sometimes karma carries a scuffed leather briefcase, knows the law, and delivers the absolute, devastating truth in exactly the way it needs to be delivered.